Welcome back to the Argentina Project podcast here at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars Latin American Program. I'm Benjamin Gedan, and I'm thrilled today to have on Skype from Buenos Aires, David Smith. He is a Woodrow Wilson Center special contributor, a former senior UN diplomat, and a former foreign correspondent. David, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome.
Pleasure.
Recently, the focus on Argentina internationally has waned somewhat. There was a great sense of crisis and chaos during a run on the Argentine peso. It resulted in a $50 billion IMF bailout request that was ultimately honored. We've seen the peso stabilize, and we've seen an impression take hold that, in fact, Argentina may be back, tentatively at least, on the right path economically and politically. On the ground, my sense is it doesn't seem quite so stable and predictable. We've recently seen a general strike that involved the transportation unions, shut down the metro, shut down the trains, shut down Argentina's international airport. What's the feeling you have on the ground, David, of where things have shaken out?
We're looking at a split screen almost. I see one half of the screen that shows us that the international community, and particularly the financial establishment, is very, very much in a serious vote of confidence for the Macri government in recent weeks. You mentioned that loan, that double quick $50 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund, which speaks to their belief, and Ms. Lagarde has told us this at the IMF.
The approval today is clear evidence of the international community's trust in Argentina's reform drive and support for the government economic plan backed by the fund.
Speaks to their belief that Argentina is the agent of change, potentially in a region of the world that cries out for that. At the same time, you've got the money men in New York and London and presumably in Singapore now reclassifying Argentina as an emerging market, which will give this country and this government, the Macri government, potentially access to billions of dollars of investment, specifically from major pension funds. And finally, you've got the G20 looming. You've got all the finance ministers of the G20 coming here in a few weeks and very much looking to get behind this government. Then the split screen on the other side, which is what I'd offer you living here day by day. We've just had the biggest general strike since the collapse of Argentina in 2001. And yes, the numbers do not look good. We are looking at 27, 28%, maybe even 30% inflation this year, which is twice what the government had forecast going into 2018. We're looking at interest rates of 40%. And what does that do to the small businesses, which this government very much wants to get behind? And yes, the peso has stabilized after that IMF loan. But the numbers suggest that the government is not going to achieve the kind of growth, for example, this year. We're now looking at probably 1% when we'd hoped for nearly 3%. So I think there's this split screen in my mind, these two narratives. One, what the world at large hopes will happen here, and two, the reality on the ground, which is that this government, a government of change, of reform, and a government, by the way, that is doing it very democratically, which we need to recognize, using dialogue and consensus and conversation rather than diktat, which has not always been Argentina's history, as you know. So therefore, we're looking at these two narratives, and where they go right now is very much, we're in a critical period.
Let's talk a bit about the political cost that going to the IMF for support and imposing some of the budget cuts that will be required as part of the IMF program might bring to Mauricio Macri in advance of the 2019 election. Now, there's been some minor good news. Poliarchia's latest survey found that support for Mauricio Macri's administration has increased from a low of 36% in May to 42% in June, but that's still well below where he was in recent months, particularly after the highly successful midterm elections last October. And there seems to be no prospect that anytime soon he'll go back to those levels of national approval. So what's the political cost, David?
There is a price for the IMF deal here domestically. And again, those two narratives, how the world sees it and how the pueblo in Argentina views it. I think we need to understand, Benjamin, that the discourse in this country, particularly since the collapse, which was the biggest single default in history back in 2001 was Argentina's then, the discourse here in those years since has been so deeply negative towards the Washington establishment intervening, helping, aiding, call it what you will, in this country. And that drip, that process of osmosis down the years, leaves us with a situation where some polls will tell you that 70% of Argentines are opposed to the IMF helping out now, even though that means borrowing money at 4%, roughly, compared to the last government, which was borrowing at about 14%. Now, this is the very kind of culture that Mauricio Macri and his government came to power saying they would confront, saying that they wish to change. And we shouldn't forget the size of the ambition as they try to change it. Hence, I would argue, and I see every day, it's a much slower, more gradual process, changing the culture, asking people to think differently after years of a discourse that has been the Washington establishment will only exploit us. The Washington establishment and the New York money men are only looking to make money out of Argentina rather than to invest in us. This is a much greater challenge for him. But I think if you look at the polls, he's bottomed out. I think we also need to recognize that next year out there, yes, there will be challenges. However, at the moment, the opposition really doesn't have a candidate. And at the moment, the smart money would say that Mauricio Macri will be re-elected. Whether he can be re-elected easily or on the first round is really another matter. And the next period, the next 6 to 9 months, in terms of the domestic politics, will be critical. One thing I'd also offer you is that in these past few days, as we saw a general strike, we saw union leaders talking openly about trying to bring this government down. And for the wider world, that is almost something we cannot understand in a democracy. What we need to understand is, however, that the history of Argentina from the late 80s, when a government had to go early because of inflation, and then 2001, where a government collapsed in the face of an economic crisis, that again is part of the culture, part of the discourse. My own read, quite clearly, is that the majority of Argentines absolutely reject that thinking. And while the general strike had a good deal of success this week, most people understand that this is not the way for this country tomorrow.
David, before we finish, I want to get a sense of the atmosphere as you observe it on the ground. The expectation going into the World Cup was that there was meant to be a truce during this period when all Argentines would be focused on nothing but soccer. Instead, we have seen, as you alluded to, this highly disruptive national strike, and you've referenced a real sense of uncertainty and tension in Argentina, particularly among labor and the government. What's the feel in Argentina? Are you walking on eggshells there every day? Is there a general sense of normalcy but dark clouds on the horizon? What do you observe?
No, I think that this is also a culture, Benjamin, that has become accustomed to the daily process of saying there may be a demonstration blocking that road. The general strike was an exception rather than the norm. And I would not, having lived in many parts of our world and some of them rather more dramatic and rather more violent than Argentina today, this is not that tense. What I do think we need to understand is that, in a sense, the Macri government is taking a very, very patient, gradual, thoughtful, consensual view of the way forward. In our wider world at the moment, I think we're a little concerned about the future of democracy. And yet we're watching a fairly young democracy in Argentina actually take the democratic path to change. And if it's on occasions tense, like it has been with our general strike, then I think we need to recognize that we have a government that the day after the general strike actually said to the trade union leaders who called the strike, we need to talk. And we need to talk about how we work together and we move forward together on wages, on benefits, on subsidies, on making our country the sum of its parts the best it can be. And, quite frankly, I think that's a very important message which the wider world may be missing, that this is also about a young democracy taking the democratic path to change.
Woodrow Wilson Center special contributor David Smith, thank you so much again for joining us from Buenos Aires.
Thank you.